My name is Sinead Gleason. I'm the Director of Literature Ireland, the organisation in Ireland which promotes Irish literature abroad. I'm really delighted to welcome you to Literature Ireland's latest event, a spotlight on the Irish short story, a long, proud and evolving tradition. We're delighted to welcome you here today to this event, which will form part of our St. Patrick's Day celebrations, presented with the support of our funders, Culture Ireland and the Arts Council. We're here to celebrate the Irish short story, and so we've invited three special speakers to take part in this conversation. All three are very much experts in the field of the short story. Welcome Wendy Erskine, Mike McCormack, and Sinéad Gleeson. Sinead's most recent anthology of Irish short stories, The Art of the Glimpse, published by Head of Zeus, includes stories by both Wendy and Mike. And all three writers have had work translated and published abroad with the support of Literature Ireland. We've invited Literature Ireland's board member, Martin Doyle, to chair today's discussion. Martin is the books editor of the Irish Times. He holds a degree in French and German from St. Andrews. And before joining the Irish Times, he worked as a journalist and an arts editor in London for a number of outlets, including the Irish World and the Irish Post. His book pages, both Irish and international, have been a source of great stimulus and inspiration for many years now, for both readers and writers of all genres. So I'm delighted to hand the floor over to Martin Doyle.
Thanks very much, Sinead. Hi, everybody. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of you and introduce you in a bit more detail. So Sinéad Gleeson is a writer of essays, criticism and fiction. Her writing has appeared in Granta, Winter Papers and Gorse, among others. Her debut non-fiction book, Constellations, Reflections from Life, won Non-Fiction Book of the Year at the Irish Book Awards and was shortlisted for the Rathbones Folio Prize. She's the editor of 4 short story anthologies, including The Art of the Glimpse and The Long Gaze Back, an anthology of Irish women writers. Sinead has worked as an arts critic and broadcaster and has presented the book show on RTE Radio 1, and she lives in Dublin. Wendy Erskine's work has been published by The Stingfly Stories, Winter Papers, and on BBC Radio 4. Her stories have been included in the anthologies Female Lines, New Writing by Women from Northern Ireland, and Being Various, New Irish Short Stories edited by Lucy Caldwell, and Sweet Home is her first short story collection. She lives in Belfast. Mike McCormack is an award-winning novelist and short story writer from Mayo. In 2016, he won the Goldsmiths Prize and the Irish Book Award Novel of the Year and Book of the Year prizes for Solar Bones, which also in 2018 won the Dublin International Literary Award. In 1996, he was awarded the Rooney Prize for Irish Literature, and in 2007, he was awarded a Civitella Ranieri Fellowship, no less. His previous work includes Getting It in the Head, Crow's Requiem, Notes from a Coma, and Forensic Songs, and he lives in Galway. So, Sinead, maybe if I could start by asking you about this big beast, The Art of the Glimpse. Could you tell me how it came about, and what your brief was and what you were hoping to achieve with, such a mammoth undertaking?
Luckily for me, Head of Zeus, the publisher, this is part of a series that they do, so it's always a non-negotiable 100 stories. So they've picked various themes over the years. Frank Wynne has just done a queer anthology. He also did an excellent collection on translation. They've done ghost stories, they've done women. There's been various sort of themes. So they had this idea. Neil Belton approached me about doing an Irish one, and it seems very daunting initially. If I add up all the previous anthologies, it doesn't come to 100 stories. So it seems like a very broad, Grand National-esque sort of field. And yet what I discovered is that it started to fill up very quickly. I always, from the previous experience of looking and hunting for stories and writers, you can't fit everyone into every collection. So I had a lot of writers in my back pocket, so to speak, people that I kind of thought if I ever had another outlet or volume, I would find space for some of those writers. But also I think anthologies are very much something that takes the temperature of a nation and a time and what we're living through. And I think that this was a way of bringing in work that people hadn't necessarily seen, people that, you know, audiences might know as writers or novelists, but maybe not short story writers. Story writers writing outside of their own comfort zones, like Roddy Doyle's story, for example, is a ghost story, which people wouldn't expect from Roddy necessarily. So it's a way of sort of finding space for 100 different writers, bringing in lots of the writers that people already know, and all of the canonical writers, you know, Beckett and Joyce, of course, would be in there, but making space for right up to the minute people who are literally just emerging, and from communities that weren't always represented, not even underrepresented, they just weren't represented in anthologies. So whether that's queer writers or writers of colour or people from traveller backgrounds. And I think 100 allows you to do that, and to look at all different types of stories. So again, there are ghost stories, there are science fiction stories, there are much more traditional sort of small Irish stories that we're used to seeing, kind of work of like maybe William Trevor, for example. But I hope that there's enough different types of experience. And I think it shows what the short story can be. It's an extremely malleable form. You can do an awful lot with it, even though there are a lot of rules.
What about Mike and Wendy, who are, you know, taking part in the event today? Then, in terms of choosing their stories, was that something that you discussed with them, perhaps, or was your own instinct as to what would sit best in the collection as part of the mix?
Yeah, I admire both of their work so much, and I loved Wendy's collection, and I just think that Wendy's story, I think of it as one of the most experimental stories in the book. It's also one of the most tender. It's one of the funniest, again, showing that you can be tender and you can be funny at the same time. And I hadn't seen a short story written like that. I'm also, myself and Wendy are both really into music, and it was kind of lovely to get a sort of a story about a fake rock star, if you like, into the book. With Mike, I remember when I was putting together the first anthology I ever edited, Silver Threads of Hope, and a writer that we mentioned before we were recording, Peter Murphy, said to me, you have to put Mike McCormack in this book. He's the greatest living Irish short story writer. So of course I immediately ran off and read all of Mike's work and thought, well, yeah, Peter's onto something here. So it was very obvious to me that Mike would be somebody in this book. And I hope there'll be more collections from both of them. I think a lot of publishers talk to writers about publishing novels all the time. And sometimes I think the short story is often overlooked in terms of collections, or publishers will take a collection off a writer, but then look for the novel. And I hope that all the writers in this book will keep on publishing collections of stories.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thanks very much, Sinead. Wendy, if I could turn to you, maybe first of all, could you tell us a little bit about the story that's in The Art of the Glimpse, 77 Facts about Gil Courtney?
Yeah, sure. So Martin, basically this is a story about a very familiar character, I suppose you would say, in music, someone that could have been someone, but it just didn't quite go right for. So you could maybe think of him as being a little bit like, I don't know, Syd Barrett maybe, or Jean Clark, or there'd be any number of those sorts of archetypes. So what we have here is basically the central story of this individual that things didn't ever quite go right for, and it's told in the form of facts, okay, like 77 actual numbered facts. I had a lot of difficulty with this story at first because I was writing it all sorts of different ways, and I'd written it from the mother's point of view, I'd written it from his point of view. It never really took off, and then it dawned on me that what I needed to do was match form and content, and I thought, well, how could this be told that's more in keeping with the actual content of the story? And once that actually came about, once it got that together, it all fitted quite well, and I could do it quite quickly. But I suppose what it's dealing with is the whole idea of is it good to be exceptional? Is it good to lead an exceptional life? You know, I was thinking of the poem Born Yesterday by Philip Larkin, where he kind of wishes for this young girl that she should grow up to be fairly unexceptional, because maybe that's the best path to happiness. And you could argue and say, well, that was quite an exceptional person wishing, you know, ordinariness on another individual. But I was looking at this person, Gil Courtney, who was terribly talented, but did his talent actually work against him leading a decent life, or a good life, or happy life? But at the same time, he produced art that was minority art. It was art that a very small percentage of people liked. But is there not a validity in that? Is there not a validity in art, even though a very small percentage of people maybe access it and and enjoy it. I'm making it sound a terribly deep and sort of philosophical thing. It's not really that. It's meant to be, you know, at the same time quite funny. And I referenced a lot of the time actuality. So, you know, there are specific references to particular people, with the result that a lot of folk have thought that this guy maybe actually exists, and that has ended up being quite funny at times when people have said to me, oh, you know, I'm not surprised he wasn't a success because, you know, I got his album and Discogs and I thought it wasn't all that, and I have to sort of bite my tongue and not say, well, he didn't exist at all, I just made him up.
No, like there is a very powerful verisimilitude to the short story, and even the format that it's done in, the kind of listicle format with that sort of ventriloquizes various different ways of, somebody I think described it as almost like a Wikipedia entry. And that doesn't sound terribly complimentary, but actually there is, like, part of the achievement of the story is the different tones or the different voices or whatever, and there, you know, there is something, you know, very deadpan. I was going to say as well, like there is a sort of a vein of humor in it. Like, I really love the description of the mother, who in some ways Elsie is maybe more of a presence or a stronger personality in the story than her son. Like, I love the description of her as the living embodiment of the oral tradition, which will remind me of many people in my own life. Like, maybe on that score, how important is humor as a vehicle for empathy in the short story or in fiction writing generally?
Sometimes it's very difficult to talk about these things because I don't want to sort of draw any general precepts from my own particular mode of working. But from my point of view, it is really, really important. Not from the point of view of, you know, it's kind of like, oh, 2 pages, there aren't any jokes in these 2 pages. Let's see what I can put in here to liven it up a bit. It's not really as kind of schematic or, for, you know, formulaic as that or whatever. But for me, I suppose I'm trying to think a lot of the time of that William Blake thing, that life is kind of like the sort of the sadness and happiness woven together, that woven together idea. And so for everything that I'm doing, a lot of my stuff is very, very doomy and very, very it is melancholy, and it's people are alienated and so on. There needs to be a kind of counterbalance to that, as kind of antithesis in terms of humor. But at the same time, in my own reading, I suppose I would enjoy stuff that would be fairly humorless as well at times. So I don't think it's a prerequisite for the short story that it needs to be humorous. But from my point of view, I like to include that because I think it's a counterbalance to a lot of the very bleak stuff that I decide to deal with.
Isn't it also perhaps reflective of the I'm not sure if it's the Irish disposition or a Northern disposition, but I remember I was reading earlier on Tom Morris writing about tips for short story writers, and one of his many tips was, remember that people can be funny too, and it is in real life. Like, if you're sitting in a pub in the evening with friends, jokes are a humorous response to even fairly bleak, whatever's on the news or whatever is part of the mix. And maybe that's not always reflected in writing, but it certainly is in yours, and I'd say in Mike's as well.
I do think that. I do think to try to I remember once hearing Anne Enright say that, writing that avoids humor and avoids sex, it's pretty difficult to do that because those two things are pretty important in life. And so if you try to eliminate them, you're deliberately really going out there trying to not include them. So there's that dimension. I suppose the only thing I'm kind of wary about is a kind of a very sort of, I don't know, maybe essentialist or kind of sort of blanket view of Irishness or about the North or whatever, that the people in the North are so funny and they've got a great sense of humor. Some do, some don't. And for some people, humor is a way of coping. For some people, it's not. So I suppose just generally, I think that, but I'm just wary of making any sort of general assumption about a particular group.
Sure. Okay, thanks. Mike, maybe bring you into the conversation. I was struck maybe by a slight parallel between your story and Wendy's, the fact that Wendy's is about a musician, and yours, Thomas Crumlish, that's in the anthology is about a sculpture, so another art form or whatever. Like sometimes I wonder, do writers use other art forms or other arts as maybe as a sort of as a way of not writing about writers themselves? Is that an audacious thing to say?
I don't think that I write about artists, and you're right. I was just as Wendy was speaking there and kind of drawing attention to this, I was scanning back through my own work, and I think I've written about over 5 books. I think I've written about 4 or 5 artists, and in nowhere in any of those books I think is there a writer. Now I know why this is, because my education in my 20s was exclusively with visual artists. My artistic education in my 20s was exclusively with artists. I lived and my wife is, and it's an ongoing thing. My wife is an artist and her work is all around me. So I get to, it's one of the things that part of my education as a writer, part of my training as a writer is actually to stand and look at something and that. And I also have a deep jealousy of what they do, that they have this incredibly tactile relationship with and physical relationship with their work. The sculptors have stone and marble and timber and concrete and whatever and that, and painters have beautiful paints and brushes and easels, and it's craftsmanship and workmanlike and all that kind of thing. And I envy that kind of physical relationship that they have with their work, and that's something that I've always envied, and that I have always I suppose celebrated in that. But it's true, they come to me much quicker than writers do. I'm a writer myself, and I know how in some sense how dull our lives are. We sit in the room and we're worried if we don't hear voices in our head, and we try to we're glad when people bring us outside and talk to us and bring us to festivals and things like that. But I think artists have a much more fuller life, I think, and a much more deeper engagement, or certainly a different engagement with the world, and I find that much more interesting to work with. And that it's certainly not the negative telling of that is that I write about artists because I don't want to write about writers. It's not that. I write about artists because I find them fascinating, and that's the short answer to the question, and the short and the long answer to the question. Yeah.
Can you in fact remember back, because this goes I think right back to the beginning of your career, doesn't it? In fact, isn't this prize won you the Hennessy literary award way back when? Isn't that right?
That's what people think, but it didn't actually. No, it got shortlisted, and it got shortlisted, and they brought out an anthology of Hennessy winners and that towards the year 2000 as a celebration of it, and that. And it was the only, they chose Thomas Crumlish as the only winner, as the only non-winner to be anthologized, and that. It didn't win it, but it's certainly a story that it's a signature piece. One of my friends says, like, oh, that's your smoke on the water. That's your kind of floor filler. And it comes from a time, it comes from a time. I used to live in a pub in Salt Hill, and I knew people coming and going to it, and sitting down, one man told me a story about how he was in NCAD in the 1970s, and he says it was a pretty rough and tough time in terms of, there was quite a rough avant-garde thing happening in Europe. People like the Viennese actionists and people like that, these really quite brutal avant-garde and that. And he said he saw some photographs of that would put the hair standing on your head and that. And that got me thinking the story evolved from that. From that, it was literally a conversation at a bar, and this person had seen these photographs from an exhibition of an Austrian German sculptor, and that. And the very first person to interview me as a writer was Mike Murphy, and Mike Murphy curated one of the first Rosk exhibitions way back in the would it have been the late 70s, early 80s, and that. And he was he was saying that he says, I think I remember that guy. So that's where the story had its origins and that. And I was really interested to hear Wendy talk about the structure of her short story and how it didn't work, because of course there's a kind of a Wendy's seems to be built on what you say is a sequence of facts and that, and mine has this structural device, which is the introduction to a gallery catalog is what it purports to be, and that. So it was at that, right from the beginning, I was very interested in the short story as an experiment, as a place for experiment, and that.
Yeah, I was gonna come on to that actually. Is that one of the attractions of writing short stories, that you can, if you're writing a novel, you're pretty much, on a set of tracks, you can sort of only go in one direction or sort of follow one sort of style, more or less. But with a short story collection, is there the opportunity to experiment, to kind of, try out, different styles and so forth?
I don't know if it's any more fruitful a place than the novel to try out experiments, but it definitely is a place for experiment. What I can say about my own work is that I'm convinced that my wildest work and my wildest ideas are in my short stories. I find myself going off in much further tangents, much more oblique angles in my short stories than I do in my novels. And in some sense, the width and breadth of a novel becomes a constraint, and the sudden flash of a short story becomes a kind of a liberation, in that, even if it is, I've often thought, the short story is the keyhole surgery of the human condition, and that, and that's I seem to find that to be a very liberating and a great place to experiment in that.
Thanks. Wendy, I don't know, are you working on a novel? Is it something that you would like to do, or do you see short story as the form that's the best fit for you?
At present, I'm working on another collection of short stories, Martin. I've nearly finished it, and but I've really enjoyed doing that again. Yeah, I would maybe like to try and write a novel, but I would also like to do other sorts of writing too. I would really like to explore doing some non-fiction. What I find is, it just to pick up on what Sinead was saying about it being a very malleable form. I suppose initially I wasn't initially drawn to writing short stories at all. I didn't think that was necessarily going to be something that I would really like, because I suppose in some ways I was so terribly put off by what I would say would be the sort of arcana of the short story. It seemed to be so theory laden, this sort of really theoretical silversmithy thing. Every single word must count. These are so highly polished, and it sounded just so difficult, and it sounded so restrictive, and it was almost, once I started looking at it in earnest, it wasn't long before I realized, no, that is one way of looking at it, but it's not the only way of looking at it. You can look at this as being an intensely flexible and very exciting form, and you can do anything you want in terms of time. It's totally elastic. You can deal with an entire life. You can deal with a couple of minutes. You look at that brilliant Ely Williams story that is just dealing with a couple of minutes, and that's it. So once that kind of dawned on me, it became a much more appealing form. And I suppose there's all sorts of things that I suppose you can do the short story that might be, and again, I'm speaking a very kind of guarded terms here, because somebody could make it work. There's things that perhaps if you try to extend over the course of 80,000 words might end up being a bit of a bore. So say, for example, I've got a story that's a set of instructions that someone has found, and it's a commentary on a set of instructions. I think I can sustain that okay for 6,000 words. I wonder if that, maybe in better hands than mine, somebody could execute it beautifully, but probably with me, that particular type of device worked for about 6,000 words or so, and then maybe it wouldn't work for too much longer. So yeah, I think it's a really exciting form. It's like endlessly varied, and you can do all sorts of things with it. And as well, you know, as I think Sinead says in the introduction to Out of the Glimpse, you know, it gives people people can work absolutely outside what they're normally known for or their usual genres or whatever in the short story. I also think as well it's terribly accessible. You know, I started writing short stories because I suppose I was working full time, and I didn't want to have to commit to some massive project that might be just not a success, not come to fruition, maybe because I just couldn't get the time to it. Short stories so accessible for people, even if you've only got, I don't know, half an hour a day after everybody else has gone to bed or whatever. If you can work on that, you will have something that maybe at the end of the month or whatever is a cohesive whole, and I think it's a very satisfying and very empowering thing for people to write on a purely practical level.
Is it important at all? Like you just pretty much said that there are no rules, and I'd agree with you, but you know, is it important or is it useful for there to be some kind of unifying theme or aspect to a collection that makes it kind of cohere in some way or other? You know, maybe in yours, there's a specificity of place. You know, most of them are set in Belfast, even East Belfast. Does that matter, or is that just the way it came out, or what would you say?
Right. I think if someone can write brilliant short stories, and one of them, I don't know, is sci-fi, the next one is social realism, the next one is something that fits into some other sort of genre, I think wonderful. That's absolutely fantastic. And I would probably totally love something like that and feel I was being taken on just such an interesting trip. For me, for me it was kind of, it just wasn't a very kind of thought out thing that I was thinking to myself, right, okay, I'm just sticking with everything around a few streets. It just developed that way, I would say, Martin. And maybe there is it does give a cohesive feel, I don't know, and maybe some of the themes of the stories in terms of sort of, I don't know, alienation or loneliness, whatever, the things that crop up over and over again. So I suppose it's just what worked out for me. It can be really, really nice to read a collection where, as you proceed through it, you are just picking up. And it's lovely when something becomes more than the individual stories, when in some way there's something that happens and a collection itself becomes something greater than the individual pieces you've learned, because I suppose you're also co-opting a reader to make meaning as well, and the reader is making connections between the stories, and that working can be something really, really magical. I don't know if that maybe happens more if it's all quite circumscribed in terms of locale or idea or whatever, but I can see how somebody could also make that work even if it was quite varied in terms of genre.
Sinead, back to yourself, like in all the collections that you've read or reviewed over the years, does anything sort of strike you about you know, what makes a collection work as opposed to an individual short story, or even maybe thinking to the anthologies that you put together, you know, how you think in terms of the pacing, or, you know, the various lengths, or even the order in which stories run?
Yeah, I mean, on one level, there are identifiable rules with the short story, and yet on another level, there are none at all. And the more I read, the more I see that people are making and remaking the short story into whatever they want it to be. Whether that's, you know, you take somebody like The Stinging Fly, for example, who don't put a word count on things. You know, the story is as long as it's meant to be. And I kind of tend to like, you know, longer short stories in a way. If you think of like Colin Bowers is in this collection, and the story it's a wonderful story from his collection, Young Skins, and you can see throughout that the stories are getting gradually longer when we get towards Calm with Horses at the end of that collection.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I know maybe Wendy and Mike have had this. I know when I'm judging short story kind of prizes and stuff, the thing that you don't know what it is you're looking for when you encounter a great short story. Often it's just that it's come in a batch that is so different to everything else that was sent in. And I think it's what I kind of tend to, I'm drawn to in stories is stuff that is surprising and not typical, very atypical, I guess. And I think we're seeing a lot more work now. I think we're, you might have the 10,000 word story, but there's a collection I read and liked last year, The Dominant Animal by Katherine Scanlan, and some of the stories are a page and a half, like most of the book. I think the stories are certainly under 1,000 words, a lot of them, and yet she manages to do something, it's not episodic, it's not small or slight, it's a very, very expanded moment of recognition in a way, in whether that's the person or the place or the object that she focuses on in the story. So yeah, and I think sometimes people can feel they're very finishable and doable, and yet I think most writers I know they tinker more with stories than they do with novels, because you can be baggy and digressive in a novel in a way you just can't with some short stories. So I think that it's important for most people to read, and this is why an anthology of 100 stories is, I hope, a good idea. You'll get a real sense of that anything's possible. You don't have to write like anybody else. You can do what you like with the form. And again, I think I've said that, like, even going back to like in the 20s, like, Somerset Maugham, and before that, like, Dickens often used his short stories as places to experiment and do the mad, wild kind of, Martian type stuff that he wouldn't get away with when the novels were being serialized in newspapers. And I think some writers have definitely done that with the work. They'd use it as a place to sort of take their work somewhere that they wouldn't go. And as Wendy says, there's a lot of ideas that won't sustain over 70 or 80,000, but you can do something really explosive and different, and surprise a reader in 10 pages. And that's all that they are most of the time. So yeah, I've learned a lot about a lot of different ways. And again, writers in this collection have surprised me with what they've done with work that you wouldn't have expected them to write. So yeah, it's a very endless possibilities with the form, I think. That's why I like it a lot, I think.
Can you then talk about an Irish short story telling tradition, given the wonderful diversity that's in it, that we all contain multitudes, and every writer individually may very well be diverse in their output, both in theme and subject. Is there common ground other than being from the island of Ireland, or is it reductive even to think of that?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's reductive, and yet we all know the importance of having a national literature, and there are commonalities and overlaps for sure. And I know that, so people have said to me before, and I was thinking about, I was reading a non-fiction piece this week by Ian Lee, who I know is a huge fan of William Trevor, and she's talked about that his kind of work is, for some people, what you think of when you think of the traditional quote unquote Irish short story. There are farms, and there are priests, and there are fields, and there's sadness, and there's alcoholism, and those kind of things. So for a long time, possibly there were certain tropes that were go-to for a certain generation of Irish writers. But I think now it's very hard to pick up an Irish short story unless somebody explicitly says it's in Cavan or Belfast or Galway or Dublin. It's harder to identify an Irish short story these days, I think, which I think is a really good thing, as opposed to a long time ago you would have got a sense. And some of the earlier pieces in this collection, you'll absolutely know they're very Irish. There's a melancholy about them. There's that kind of the large cloud of emigration hanging over a lot of the early stories, and emigration still exists. It hasn't gone away. It's just a different kind of emigration. It's a less permanent thing than what it used to be. So yeah, I find that a lot of writers, some writers don't mind being called Irish writers. Some writers are really bothered by it, and yet we are united by the fact that it's also very specifically the way we speak in this country, the Irishness of how a lot of people in Ireland speak, whether you're in East Belfast or you're in Kerry, and we've a very distinct command of the language, and we're a very kind of talky sort of oral culture. And I think years of talking about and telling stories, and sitting by fires and all that kind of stuff, where you would have to keep the whole story in your head. Maybe that's where the short story comes from. You couldn't keep a whole novel in your head or tell it over the course of one night around a fire. But I do think we're very interested in the words we use and how we use them, and that's there's a very much a musicality in the Irish short story that isn't always there in other literatures, national literatures anyway.
Wendy, put roughly the same question to you. Am I right in thinking you starting off writing or having your stories published in The Stinging Fly, or were you published elsewhere as well? I'm not sure.
No, I had not a thing published in my life until 2016, and The Stinging Fly published the first story that's in my collection, Anthologies. That was the first thing I'd ever had published. So yes, I've got The Stinging Fly to thank for my world domination. Yes. So no, yes, it's been very, very good. But I think everything that Sinead's saying there is so interesting, because you've got that whole aspect of, you know, what might be considered Irish tropes versus then the sort of universal concerns that are going to crop up. You know, it's the same whether you're, you know, universal concerns, whether you're in, I don't know, New Zealand, Ireland, Nigeria, whatever. And it's that kind of idea as well, you know. Like a lot of my stuff, as you say, is set in East Belfast, but I get kind of frustrated about that if people just regard that as like local colour literature. Oh, isn't it so cute, the way she got all those shops in the right order down that street and all the rest of it. Because it's the sense that it diminishes it a little. I don't want to get I'm not annoyed about it, but it diminishes it a little because it makes it seem as though it just makes it, diminishes it whenever I suppose you're trying also to deal with things that are universal concerns. But as soon as you say that, you sound so unbelievably pompous that, you know, my concerns are timeless and universal. But
well,
I would
like even in today's paper, John Self interviewed Kazu Ishiguro, and he made the point that he doesn't mind somebody saying that's a sci-fi novel or that's whatever, but he did mind the fact that his first two books, I think, were set in Japan, and he was sort of miffed that, you know, people said, oh, that's sort of, you know, holding a window up to Japan, whereas that wasn't his concern at all. His concern was, you know, whatever the subject matter, which he felt was universal. And that's why, you know, I think he said his next books deliberately in England, so it wouldn't be a kind of exotic Orientalism that people would be coming to his fiction for. They'd be coming for it for, you know, the human stories that he wanted to tell. Yeah.
Yes, and that just makes such a lot of sense. And you know, that idea of Ireland, you know, what does it mean to be Irish? You know, that idea of, by virtue of being on the same landmass, you know, some guy that's doing a wee bit of writing while he's working in a factory in Mid-Ulster and, I don't know, taking ketamine at the weekends, you know, by virtue of being on the same landmass, does he have a lot in common in his fiction with a 70-year-old woman from Ducky? You know, it's all those sorts of things. I find it fascinating. Maybe they do. Maybe you could look at them. Maybe I'm judging unnecessarily, and perhaps if you looked at their work, you would see things that they had in common. But I love that, the local and the particular versus the universal and the Irish short story. It's a totally fascinating topic.
Mike, over to you in the top right-hand corner.
I was, yeah, very, very interested to hear what Sinead was saying there, because it speaks to my own kind of, I suppose, troubled relationship with the Irish short story, and that the Irish short story is it's a kind of a sacred cow in Irish cultural life. It's what we're known for. It's one of the things we're known for abroad, and it's one of the things that we like to be known for. We've entered into this kind of collusive relationship with the world. Like, they say, "Oh, you're the ones that write the great short stories," and we kind of simper up to that. And I find it very comfortable. My own belief is that in large measure, the Irish short story is largely being conservative in its application and in the way it's gone about its own business. I think it is largely borrowed from, you know, the 19th century developments of Chekhov, and that it's come down to us via Dubliners and the Untilled Field, that it's come it's been sieved through those two channels down to us. And largely what we get is through the great Irish short story writers of the 20th century, you know, and I have them here, O'Whelan and O'Flaherty and Edna O'Brien and Mary Laveran and McGahern and people like that, is largely a 19th century short story that preoccupies itself with single line linear narratives that seem to think that the human condition is exclusively a notion of human relationships, and that's what we have thrived on. That definition of the short story is what we have thrived on. And that back at the beginning, when the Untilled Field and Dubliners were published, there was something choking about that choked off the brilliant fantastical tradition of the 19th century. And that there's something like we forgot the work of Fitzjames O'Brien, we forgot the work of Sheridan Le Fanu. And of course, we were about the process of nation building, and we were about the process of making a realism. So we wrote a realist literature, and that's the way it came out in our short stories and that. Now, latterly, in the last 10 or 15 years, and in a general mood of renewed experiment, it seems like that we have returned to the notion of experiment in the short story. And we see it in Wendy's own work, we see it in people like June Caldwell's work, and we see it in a book like Hostages, where there's not just a thematic, there's not just a formal experiment, but there's a kind of a thematic experiment as well. We're not just looking to the past, we're not just looking to human relationships, we're looking to the future, looking towards technology and everything like that. So I think that this is a great moment to be kind of taking the temperature of the short story, and particularly taking it in such a kind of a almost definitive fashion. Sinead's anthology there. Did you say, Sinead, that Samuel Beckett is in that collection?
Yeah, he is. I chose Ping, which is a story that I love, which is, again, you could write theses upon theses about that story and the repetition and what the sound is and what it means. And I think he uses the word white about 87 times or something, and it's only a 4-page story. There's hundreds of things I could say about that story, but it was really important for me to put Beckett in there. And again, when you look at the collections of Beckett's work, they're often just called prose pieces. They're not even called short stories when you look at the early editions of them anyway. But there's a read along going on at the moment, 100 Days of the Art of the Glimpse. And when people got to that story, there was a lot of giving out about it online and people just scratching their heads. And that's what I love about Beckett. Like it's an immersive experience. It's not even a short story. It's not even about reading. There's a 360 kind of interactivity that requires you. Some stories make you work harder than others, and yet I don't find that story hard work. I find it really entertaining, and but you have to step into it and then step back out. It really kind of grabs you.
I think in any survey of the Irish short story, and that is completely incomplete without Beckett. And Beckett is never mentioned as a short story writer. And I think actually his experiments in them are so radical that he falls outside our conception of what a short story is. And I could be wrong, but I think that this is the first anthology recent anthology within which he is anthologized as a short story writer. And that's I think that's an important moment. I think that there's been a proper realignment of the short story by putting Beckett into it. A definitive, the montage has been filled out. There was this blank hole in it. Every anthology of Irish short stories that went up to the late 20th century, none of them had Beckett. But now we do have one that has Beckett, and I think there's an air of completion about the job now that he's there.
Thinking about short stories being translated, Mike, your work has been translated. Have you had dealings when that has happened directly with the translator, or is this just something that goes on without your involvement?
Oh, it can go both ways. It can go both ways. And you talk to translators, and they will tell you different stories. Some translators don't like to admit that they're indecisive about anything. They think that gives the writer the heebie-jeebies, and that they lose confidence. That they lose confidence in them. Where I would see it as the complete opposite. I would see it as a translator being confident enough to ask questions on that. And and I've been fortunate enough to, I think some of my happiest, recent, I had French translation and I've had German translation, and both of them were very conscientious. I was answering questions for days after them and that. But I thought it was a mark of their confidence, and that they felt confident enough in their own ability to ask a question about something they didn't know. So I felt pretty assured that I was in safe hands and everything. The one thing that got me was that my first book of short stories was translated into into Croatian of all things. The very first translation of my work was into Croatian, and when I went, they and I didn't know this, but Croatia sees Ireland as a kind of a sister republic. They see us as as a small Catholic country on the wrong end of the colonial project. And so they had this kinship, and when my book when Getting It in the Head was reviewed in Croatia, they were adamant I was a Croatian writer. This is what I was billed at, and they saw these tales of redemption and transgression, and that they seemed to see a very Croatian Catholicism in it, and that. And I got invited there, and I toured there on the back of it. Toured, it sounds like, Westlife or something, but I certainly did some readings in that. And I was amazed at the questions that they asked. Sure, yeah, this sounds like an Irish audience in that. One of the things they used to ask was again and again and again, and it became a side bet with the person who was going with me, was, what do you think? They would ask me, you've been here for 3 days, what do you think of Croatia? Every single audience without fail asked me that. And I was saying, there was a time in Ireland when we used to ask people that. And I says, now we're either so assured of ourselves or so arrogant that we don't bother asking that anymore. But Croatia at the time was newly independent, and they were anxious to know how they were projecting themselves at that early stage. And that, what do you think of Croatia? Yeah. So, and it's a beautiful place, and it's beautiful, hospitable people. Yeah.
Sinead, your work has just been translated into French, hasn't it? Constellations. Again, same with you. Did you have much interaction with your translator, or none at all?
Yeah, I did a lot of clarification, and it's a very sensitive translation. And funnily enough, Constellations is coming out in Germany in May, and I haven't heard from the translator at all. So I think it's an interesting one. I actually, speaking of fiction, a short story of mine that you published, Martin, The Lexicon of Babies, which was in Lucy Caldwell's collection, that's going to be published in Polish in a journal over there. I'd be interested to see how that works out. But yeah, it's kind of like editing. I think I'd almost be a little bit alarmed if I didn't hear from someone. I'm always curious to sort of, and that's not to say that I either assume someone's really brilliant, and it's not that they're not curious about your work or that they've got it right. I understand everything, but it's kind of nice to have that, because I think translators are quite undersung heroes in the literary world, and it's lovely to sort of make the connection and be able to go, thank you for taking this time and attention with my work, even if it's only one question or 25. But yeah, I personally would always like to hear from someone. The book's getting translated into Portuguese for Brazil, and the person who's doing it is actually somebody I happened to meet in Brazil a couple of years ago, who has, we've kept in touch, and she loved the book and has offered to translate it, even though that's not her full-time job. So that's kind of, this is someone I'll actually know doing it, which is, that'll be quite a nice thing, actually, because generally it's someone anonymous you don't know. So I'm excited about that.
What about you, Wendy? I think your work has been translated, but we're speaking.
It actually comes out in Italy next month. But I haven't had any dealings or conversations with the translator at all, and it's also being translated into Arabic, which is really, really good. But again, I haven't had any conversations about that. I think To All Our Jews was translated into Danish, which was recorded then, and that was actually a really lovely thing to hear. I heard one Saturday night, I listened to a thing, and it was like a translation slam with Frank Wynne and another translator simultaneously translating a piece of writing, and it was so engrossing. I mean, it really was, the way they were just weighing every single word, and the various permutations, and the various shades of meaning. It was a wonderful thing. So absolutely, I mean, even if you really know nothing about translation, when you read a book that's been really well translated, it, I think. Even if this is something you don't have a very sophisticated understanding of, I think you just have a reaction to it.
Does it make you look at your work almost from a different perspective, like a kind of a long view or an outsider's view? If you think, well, what is somebody in Cairo or Rio de Janeiro going to make of my short story set in Belfast? I know we've spoken already about, the importance of universality or whatever, but do you kind of think to yourself, God, how are they going to translate that word or expression, or how will people understand that kind of something that is peculiar to the North or whatever?
Yeah, I suppose, right, I suppose if I'm thinking really brutally, I think it would be a very crippling thing if you sat down when you started to write, think, gosh, this might be translated into Serbian, so I better not go too specific here because Serbian people might not get this. So I think if you started, it would be a really very, very would just be a very kind of oppressive thing to think how it might be received around the world, for sure. But having said that, I think in some way specificity locks people out of some things. Sometimes I think when you go really, really specific, that's wonderful for the people who can access that detail, but at the same time that also locks out the people who can't. And so it's always a balancing act with that. I'm a really big William Faulkner fan, and I suppose you could say that whole idea of the county, the sort of the the county that he's always writing about, he goes so specific about that, and some people would say you go so super specific that then becomes universal. And if you can get the real detail of that specific place right, that then becomes universal. I'm not so sure about that. I think that's Faulkner. Faulkner's brilliant, and he can do that. So I suppose I would just wonder with some of the things that I would write about, just how accessible it would be. Say for example, I'm writing a story where a woman who is deeply sectarian, has been deeply sectarian her whole life, and yet suddenly now feels attracted to a guy. She's now in her 50s, 60s even, and she now feels attracted to a guy who plays GAA, and she's reevaluating the mug that she has at the back of her cupboard that has got Irish style writing. I don't know how that's going to go down other places. I don't know how that'll go down in Egypt, which is where the translation's happening. We'll just see. But it's wonderful that anybody's bothering, so delighted.
Maybe just to wrap, what are the short story collections or short story writers that you really admire? Who are the writers that have blown you away in the last 12 months, couple of years? Start with you, Wendy.
Okay. I have really, really loved the writer Jamel Brinkley, who is writing in the States, and I think it's all to do with looking at masculinity, and looking at masculinity in a particular type of community in Brooklyn. I've really, really loved his stories. Linda Mannheim, This Way to Departures, published by Influx. I think she's an absolutely brilliant writer. I've really, really liked Alligator and Other Stories, Dima, Al-Zayat, just really, really, really very experimental at times. I thought they were just wonderful. There's loads and loads and loads of collections. I think there's so much stuff. My old favourite from ages ago is just Frances Malloy, Women of the Scourge of the Earth, one of my favourite collections. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Louise Kennedy collection coming out soon. I'm really excited about that. There's just so many.
Mm-hmm. Mike?
Yeah, I didn't know you were going to ask that question. And the postman came just 2 or 3 hours ago, and he brought me a book that I'm looking forward to reading.
Pure Gold.
John McHugh's Pure Gold. I know quite a bit of the work in this. He's a brilliant young writer. For all my talk about experiment and everything, I'm going to go with a writer who work I just found so compelling was Nicole Flattery's Show Them a Good Time. I just thought there was something in the key and register of that book, in the carefulness of it, in the close analysis and study that she does of a character without it becoming choking or suffocating. I just thought there was something so compelling about that. So original that I couldn't actually go about telling you what it is. She reminds me in some sense of She reminds me of a young Anita Bruckner or something like that, or a kind of a Rachel Cusk or something like that, that has just this indefinable stamp about them that you can say, I don't know what it is, but just read it.
It's got a dark sense of humor. Yep, I really like that too.
It's all of that. And just an old school book that I read Ron Rash's, what's it called? Pure Gold. What is it, Sinead, that I read The Ascent there last night again, and
Which it has gold in the title as well. God,
it has gold in the title, yeah. No, it's just that I read it there the other day and I really liked it. And look, the daddy is J.G. Ballard. Anything by him will tide you over. If you want to go, please go to Myths of the Near Future. That was the book that turned my head as to what the short story was capable of doing.
Very good. And Sinead, finally you.
I'm just going to second the Louise Kennedy stories, because I one of the best collections to come out of Ireland a really long time. Absolutely loved it, and you know, she started writing so late, and she's just this naturally gifted writer. Katherine Lacey had an incredible collection with Granta called, I think it's called Certain American States, a couple of years ago, that I loved. And a collection that I recommend repeatedly to people is Carmen Maria Machado's Her Body and Other Parties. And that is a collection that, when we're talking about the cohesion of collections, every single story in that is so different. There's a pandemic story, there's kind of sci-fi stories, there's a story at a writer's group, there's ghost stories, there's stories about pornography. It's just, she's really assured, and she tries everything and pulls all of it off, and it's a wonderful collection. I'm always pushing that on to people. Also, I just wanted to say that one of the joys of this anthology is really, really new work, and Owen de Vardoon has published a collection with Skeen, Why the Moon Travels, and it's folkloric, it's very deeply rooted in traveller culture, very much about the land, and very much observation and thinking and being and mortality and all those things. And they're very short, they're very elegiac, they're just very evocative and beautiful. And I'd only discovered Owen's work as I was putting this together, so I'd urge people to read that book, a book they might miss. It's a wonderful small press, Skeen, who published Malata Uche Akori as well. So yeah, watch what they're doing.
I think, not sure if we mentioned the title, so Louise Kennedy's is The End of the World is a Cul-de-sac, that's coming out in April. I'd add in, I think, Danielle McLaughlin's Dinosaurs and Other Planets, which is superb, but a few years ago, Colin Barrett, Young Skins, which all sort of set in a town in the west of Ireland, and just like Pure Gold, I think, is set in Achill. It's not named, but it's an island in the west. And Tom Morris's, what the hell is it called? Can't remember now. They're all set in his hometown in South Wales. Yeah, all very good. Okay, folks. So listen, thank you very much for giving up your time to talk to Literature Ireland and their audience today. So thanks very much, Wendy. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Sinead. Catch up soon.
Thank you for joining us for this special Literature Ireland event, a spotlight on the Irish short story, a long, proud and evolving tradition. I think you'd agree with me that we've really had some great insights on the genre today. We've learned that it's a form of keyhole surgery on the human condition, as Mike McCormack said, that it's an intensely flexible genre, that it can provide opportunities to explore every aspect of the human condition. It's both local and particular and universal. That, according to Sinéad Gleason, one of the Irish short story's main characteristics is the use of language. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear these three writers talk so eloquently and so profoundly about the short story. I'm looking forward to hearing and reading many more short stories as a result of today's conversation. I think you viewers will probably agree with me. We've learned so much and been prompted to look in so many different directions at so many great Irish writers. Here in Literature Ireland, we're very much looking forward to supporting many new Irish writers, both of the short story and of other genres. Wendy Erskine's collection of short stories will appear shortly, as she mentioned, in a production published by Al Arabi publishers in Cairo. And Sinead Gleason's most recent book, Constellations, has just appeared with Éditions de la Table Ronde in Paris, in France. Mike McCormack has been published widely in Norwegian and Italian and Croatian and German, and we very much look forward to supporting these writers and many other writers and bringing the best of Irish literature in the finest translations to you, readers and lovers of Irish literature around the world. So all that remains for me to do now is to thank Martin Doyle, our host today, and our three speakers, Wendy Erskine, Sinead Gleason, and Mike McCormack. Thank you.